Hello, and thanks for joining this OASPA webinar. We have a very busy one today, so we're just going to give everyone the chance to join, and we will start once we have a few more participants in the room. Okay, numbers are building very quickly. If you have just joined the webinar room, welcome to OASPA's webinar today. You are all very welcome. We are just going to give it a few more moments and then we will start with the webinar. As you join, and just as we allow a few more people into the webinar room, feel free to share where you're joining us from today, and we will start shortly just as the numbers build some more. Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to make a start. So thank you and welcome to today's OASPA webinar. The webinar is now open and will be recorded. So when you opt into joining an OASPA webinar, you are also opting into the participant agreement, and we will share the link for that in the chat box. The slides from today's speakers and the recording will be shared in a few days and will be available on the OASPA website. If you've registered for the webinar, you'll also receive an email notifying you of the recording and the slides. So as the numbers build, I will hand over to today's chair, Katrina McCullum. Over to you, Katrina. Thanks very much, everyone.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this OASPA webinar. We're really delighted to have three such expert speakers with us today. Dorothy Bishop from the University of Oxford, Adam Day from Sage, and also Clear Skies, his company, and Brian Nosek, who is from the University of Virginia and helped found and founded the Center for Open Science. It's also the largest webinar we've ever hosted at for OASPA. We have about 940 people registered, which is just amazing. It's the largest ever. We normally get about 50% attending live. We've got registrants from 67 countries. 2/3 are from the UK and North America, and the rest are from countries from all other continents. They come from 650 different organizations, mostly from an academic library, but with publishing organizations next, and then others from academic research backgrounds, not-profits and charities, service or technology organizations, funders, government and NGO organizations, and independent others. So I think that just tells you about the interest and timeliness of this topic. So just a bit of logistics. We are going to have question and answers. We hope that you will just feel free to put whatever questions you want. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, for your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can as possible today. We normally have a commitment as well to answer. We will ask the panelists to respond to any questions that we haven't had time to answer today, and we'll try and post those as well. So why is there such interest in this topic? And I think it's because over the past year or two, the publishing industry has been hit by a perfect storm. And I know because my company is at the sharp end of this. And it's a storm that's been created by a hyper-competitive and perverse evaluation system for researchers, alongside a dysfunctional system of scholarly publishing. Authors have now become so desperate to publish that they are willing to fabricate articles and even pay to have the peer review process manipulated. And editors and reviewers are colluding with this. This has been compounded by commercial incentives for publishers, including not-for-profit publishers, society publishers, subscription publishers, as well as open access publishers, to maximize growth and revenue while relying on legacy systems and services that are out of date, opaque, inequitable, and can't scale. This perfect storm has left publishers vulnerable to fraud at scale, and trust on all sides and in science itself is breaking down. But we are here today to talk about solutions and openness and how implementing open science practices can help both mitigate against fraud, uphold integrity and ethical standards, and help restore trust back to scholarship and to publishing. And we're all accountable. There's a lot of blame in all of this, but we are all accountable: researchers, publishers, institutions, and funders. And we all have a role to play and a responsibility to take action. And the sort of action is now going to be, that we can take, is going to be explained by our speakers. And so without any more ado, I'm going to hand over to Dorothy to start the process. Thanks very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Well, hello, and it's a great pleasure to be here with such a large audience. It's very impressive. I'm going to say a bit about open practices in helping prevention and detection of fraud. And perhaps before I go into that, I should explain why everybody is so concerned about this. Because when I came into science, if you talked about fraud, people thought it was a rare thing, and that science would be self-correcting. But as time is going on, it's becoming very clear that fraud is not so rare. And indeed, one of the issues is that it's not just being conducted by the odd bad actor, it's being done at this industrial scale by these organizations that have been known as paper mills. And there've been features in Nature and Science and on Retraction Watch pointing out the extent to which there's a problem. And indeed, in last July, the US House Committee on Science, Space and Technology had a whole session on this to try and find out more about it, because it's becoming clear that if you've got people who are selling publications and making a huge profit out of it, that you're going to have a big issue, not just the odd occasional fraudulent paper. This guy, Nick Wise, who even as a graduate student did a huge amount to clean up one particular paper mill, his own work has resulted in more than 850 retracted papers, has been prowling around in Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, in this sort of dark underbelly of the scientific world, finding these channels who are selling authorship, selling not just authorship of papers, but also citations, because it's not just enough to have a paper published. If you want to get on in science, you have to get it cited. So what you get are people who are usually operating through corrupt editors, who then will place a whole load of papers for a fee in their journal. And these are often just fabricated and no use to anybody. But this is going on at scale and getting bigger and bigger. So what can we do about this? Now, the next speaker, Adam Day, is going to talk a bit about what he's been doing, which is to tackle the detection of these paper mill articles at scale. I tend to think that what we have here is a situation where it's a bit like having a virus, just as we've all got used to now having viruses circulating around. And we know that what you have to do on the one hand is to identify when there's cases occurring, so you test and trace. But also you need to inoculate against the virus. And I think some of what Brian Nosek's talking about will relate to this, and how you create a situation where viruses won't flourish in the first place. And then you need to sort of quarantine those who are affected. And that is a problem, which typically means, you know, sort of somehow getting rid of these things altogether from the literature. And that's often a slow and not very good process. But I want to just emphasize how open science can help with all these stages. So just tracking down paper mills, the important thing to realize is that if you're trying to find paper mill products, they do tend to mutate, because as soon as somebody realizes that you've worked out how they're doing it, they will change what they're doing. So you're really playing a cat and mouse game with the people who run the paper mills. But there are some paper mill products that are very easy to spot just on cursory inspection. And I've had some fun with these because some of them are hilariously funny. I mean, they're just crazy articles where somebody's bolted together a bit of an essay on Marxism with a bit of a section from Wikipedia on machine learning, and then a bit more Marxism. And I call this an AI gobbledygook sandwich. These are really easy to spot, and you don't really need much technological sophistication. And there's a lot of them in the literature, just because nobody's really been properly vetting editors who will just be happy to place these. But more seriously, there are others that look a lot more plausible, and I suspect we're missing a lot of those. And some of these are designed from a template so that you have what looks like a plausible article because it's built on what was a good article, but it's just changed some of the detail. And these are very prominent. These were discovered to exist at scale in fields like cancer genetics. If you want to try and track this down, you need to be able to read a lot of papers, and you need to be able to identify networks of people doing this. That's the quickest way to find them, because once you find an editor, for example, who's accepting these sorts of things, you can look at the other things they're accepting. So open access here is very helpful because you can at least check articles and cited articles when you're exploring a network, and you can find out, are people citing nonsense articles, which is a characteristic of paper mill papers, because they're trying to build up citations of other papers from the paper mill. So open access is good for that. But less talked about is the importance of open data and open code, so the scripts that you use to analyze your data. And the interesting thing about these aspects of open science is that they've been very much argued for, not in the context of fraud. And I've been very much somebody who said we need open data, we need open code, because it's good for reproducibility of science and for just checking how things are done and helping people learn how to do things properly. Philip Stark has written beautifully about this in what he calls pre-producibility, that science at the moment, a lot of it seems to be more like an advertisement. He's very scathing about people who don't make their data and code public, and said you just have to trust them, and so it's just like an advertisement. But what you need are people saying, here's what I've done, and if it's wrong, I may have erred, but at least I'm honest. The interesting thing I've found is that if you look at paper mill papers, they often will have a statement at the end saying data is available on request, but of course it isn't. Now, that's not just true of paper mill papers, unfortunately. That's often true of papers that are not paper mill paper. But I think we need to change the culture so it becomes more normative to expect data to be made available, except under very specific circumstances where it's not feasible. The other thing that is barely used, but I think it must become more prominent if we're going to tackle this, is open peer review. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether peer review should be open, and a lot of it has revolved around concerns from peer reviewers that if their name is made available to the author of a paper that they've criticized, this may be used against them, particularly if there's a power imbalance. But the interesting thing about open peer review is, I think the key thing is not, I mean, it's nice sometimes to know who wrote the peer review, as we shall see, but it's more important to know what the peer review contains, because you can then judge whether it was a proper peer review or whether it was a fake peer review. And fake peer review is yet another feature of paper mills. And I'll just give you a little example of this, which I was involved in analyzing. There's a paper mill that is called the Tanu Pro paper mill. And it was discovered by Anna Abalkina, who's an expert on hijacked journals that have been taken over by fraudulent publishers. But she found that there were people who were using email domains that were purchased but were not proper email domains. And Tanu Pro was one of these. And if you started finding papers where the author had that particular email domain, it was an indication that they were part of this paper mill. This was a fake email address, and it was used for authors and probably also for peer reviewers. And these papers tended to appear in special issues and in hijacked journals. But she and I got in contact because some of these papers were in a psychology journal that was quite a reputable psychology journal. And she wanted to know whether they were really paper mill products or not. And we did a bit of looking at these and found, I read them, there were 6 of them in this one journal, Journal of Community Psychology. And I could tell from reading them that they were pretty nonsensical. It was very hard to tell what people had done and why. They rambled on in all sorts of directions. But the real killer for this, detecting this as a fake paper, was the peer review. So all 6 papers in this collection where they had open peer review, which the journal fortunately had adopted on the whole, were by people who you couldn't actually find online. So Georgina Smith from the University of the Sunshine Coast, I could not find that she'd ever published anything, and I couldn't find her at the University of the Sunshine Coast, which does exist, but not with this person there. But also the peer review, when you read it, if you've ever done peer review, you would recognize this as the most incredibly superficial peer review possible. So just, I rate this article quite positively, it's worthy for publication. And then it's just very vague. It doesn't engage with the content of the paper at all, which in fact would be hard to do because the content of the paper is completely, can't work out what it's about. But things like, turn your large paragraphs into smaller ones and correct numerous inaccuracies. And this phrase, the literature should be refreshed, recurs across several of these peer reviews. And then when it comes back after revision, then it's sort of talked about how wonderful it is. And of course, it's a nonsense paper. But you can tell that this is not real peer review. So my view is that more journals should adopt this kind of open peer review because it makes it much, much easier to sort out the genuine from the non-genuine cases. The other thing is post-publication peer review. So we have PubPeer as a place where people can post comments about papers that have already been published. They're very often critical. They don't have to be critical, but more often than not, they are. But a number of sleuths have been going through the literature and making sure that things that look like paper mill outputs get flagged up on PubPeer, often with quite short comments that might just note some fundamental flaw in that paper. Now, I did an analysis of journals in special issues published by Hindawi, and this is just a little plot to give you an idea of the way PubPeer can be very helpful, because what I was looking for was I was distinguishing between editors who were just regular editors, reg pp, minus special issue editors, but who had no PubPeer comments on anything that they'd accepted, and then special issue editors SIPP plus, who did have PubPeer comments on things that they'd edited. And you can see that there's a big difference between that last group and the other two. And these are just showing you how many papers they accepted for a special issue. Special issues normally have only 10 up to 20 papers. These people were accepting 100 papers for a special issue. And then also the median time to respond to somebody. So the date from acceptance up to the date when you had it responded to. Very, very fast, far too fast for proper peer review to have taken place. So post-publication peer review is a very useful thing to flag up these sorts of problems. Can we prevent these sorts of problems as well as sort of detecting them after it's occurred? So Jennifer Byrne, who's been at the forefront of discovering these more plausible paper mill papers in cancer genetics, has argued that some sort of pre-registration requirement for papers would be very helpful in stopping the paper mills in their tracks, simply because in her field, as in many fields, to do a proper study takes time. It takes about a year to do a proper cancer genetic study. If you were required to pre-register what you were going to do, and then there would be a time scale on how long it should take you to do that, people could then check back and see, had it been pre-registered? Whereas at the moment, these papers are being churned out in days because they're just being generated by changing a template a little bit. So I think that's a very interesting suggestion. And I've been at the forefront of being interested in pre-registration and other contexts for, again, improving reproducibility of science. But I think the idea that it can also help prevent fraud is very interesting. So just to sum up, I think if we want to tackle paper mills, open science is really helpful. And many of the things that we did to try and improve science without thinking about fraud are going to come into their own. Now we're facing this large amount of fraud. Pre-registration can be helpful. Open access makes it easier to check the articles. Open data, open code can check that findings are sensible and reproducible. You can identify dodgy peer review if you've got open peer review. And there's a huge role for open post-publication peer review that particularly the PubPeer website plays. And that's enough from me, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Oh, and just to say, none of this is adequately funded, unfortunately. So a lot of the work of doing this is at the moment being done by unpaid, enthusiasts, we should say.
Thanks so much, Dorothy. That was a great start and provided a nice framework for the other two speakers to come. That point actually, which we haven't picked up on, but maybe we can pick on up on in the questions about funding, is hugely important, because all of these checks, all of these balances, all of these processes take time, and we can't rely on volunteers and volunteer platforms to implement them. There's a healthy conversation going on in the chat. That's great. The questions already started. Do put questions into the Q&A. Carry on chatting among yourselves. And so I'm now going to hand over to Adam, and then we'll take all the questions at the end after Brian's. Thanks very much.
Okay, just trying to get my screen to share. Hopefully we can all see that. Okay, so I just wanted to say a little bit about how open is different. And what I mean by that is it's obviously different from not open, and it's different from perhaps what some of us might have hoped for, people who've been involved in open access for a long time. I'm not sure why I've included a picture of me here. This is a video webinar, but here it is anyway. You can see what I look like. I'm a data scientist, former physics journal editor. Physicists were doing open access back before it was cool with arXiv, and most of those journals that I edited had a big overlap with arXiv. So that's mostly a kind of green OA background that I come from. I co-wrote the open source Sage rejected article tracker. It turns out that that tool is quite good at detecting duplicate submissions, which it also turns out are hallmarks of paper mill activity. That was an accident, but I'm willing to take credit for it. I later did a paper on detecting peer review rings, which also turn out to be paper mills, but that one was actually on purpose. And I founded Clear Skies, which is a small company that has a number of pipelines for detecting paper mill products. I'm going to talk about three things here. I'm going to talk about open metadata, open tools, and just this point about how open is different. And there are good and bad things there. So there's this famous quote in computer science, which is that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Right? And the idea is that if you get enough people to look at your computer code, the chances of them finding problems are higher. I kind of like it because it doesn't say the problems will be found or that they will be corrected. I think with open science and open access particularly, the idea is that by having content out there, that self-correcting nature of science is accelerated because more people can see it, more people can find the flaws, more people can correct them and improve on past work. That's the idea, but it certainly does work that way. But also we see plenty of examples now where there is problematic content that has been published that we're aware of, but which hasn't yet been corrected. There's something which is really relevant here, which maybe a lot of people don't think of as being an open science practice, but it is, and it's very critical to detection methods, which is open metadata. As an industry, we have some great sources of open metadata, and there's opportunity to make those better for this purpose, for the purpose of research integrity. But this is very valuable. It's actually fundamental to the work I do in detecting paper mills. So one of the things you get to do there is graph analytics or network analytics. Dorothy spoke about networks, kind of the same thing. So that's where you have things like papers and authors, and you have relationships between things, like an author might be an author of a paper, therefore there's an authorship relationship there. And if you have another author with an authorship relationship with the same paper, you can start to make inferences that you can say these authors must be co-authors, right? And that could be a useful thing to know, because it might mean that you don't want one author to referee the other author's papers because they're probably pals. Graph analytics gets very complicated. It's a real pain. It's not a lot of fun. I don't recommend doing it for a laugh. But from a research integrity perspective, it's fundamentally quite simple, right? Because what we need to do is we need to identify an author and we need to connect them to dodgy behavior. It's very simple in that sense. And we actually have some great data sources for doing that. Things like ORCID, which is very good for author disambiguation. Then we have a lot of data sets which can describe authors' behavior, things like Crossref, PubMed, OpenAlex, all of which we've used at Clear Skies and all of which are very, very useful. There's this principle that comes up when you look at fraud detection and the kind of security processes that, say, for example, banks take. So banks do this thing called KYC, know your customer. And that's the kind of processes that they go through when you sign up for a bank account. They want to know exactly who you are. They want to identify you uniquely, make sure they know that you're a real person and not someone committing fraud. These things are quite important. And I think ORCID is a great start for doing this kind of stuff in our industry. So maybe we should have our own version of that, KYA, know your author. Okay. Out of these two, who do you think is most likely to be the fraudster? Okay, so we've got one person. This might be an author for our journal, okay, and he has a long history with the journal, well-maintained ORCID, doesn't pay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so we know a lot about him. Then we have this other author who comes in and he's got no history, empty ORCID, and brand new webmail address. Now, if you're a journal editor, you're looking at this and you're thinking, I've seen this before, right? I've seen this case before where we have someone come in with this empty history and it turns out to be a case of fraud. Now, none of this stuff here is actually evidence of misconduct, and it shouldn't prejudice you against this individual. What it does tell you is that you need to know the author better. You need KYA, you need to know the author. Here's a funny thing, right? What if it's both? Okay, well, what if both of them are involved in research fraud? Well, now it's actually this one, okay? This one is the easier one to find the evidence because there's much more interactions. Dorothy mentioned registered reports. One thing about them that's quite cool is that, well, it's just one more interaction, right? It's one more thing that a fraudster would have to manage if they want to maintain a lie, right? Makes it harder. Time is always on your side, okay? The way I like to think about it is there's no such thing as a fraudster who's not been caught. Okay, there's fraudsters who have been caught, there's fraudsters who haven't been caught yet. But eventually, you know, the truth will come out and we'll find them. And actually, this is another fundamental thing with fraud detection, is that time is a factor in trust, okay? Because the longer you've known someone and the more interactions you've had with them, the more you trust them. And it's a very important concept there. So we've spoken a bit about authors and about identifying authors, understanding our relationships with authors, how important those are. Let's talk a bit about dodgy behavior. How do we identify that? So I put out this blog post last year saying, here's how to find all the paper mills. And it's quite simple. Really, all we need to do fundamentally is we just need to make sure that submission dates for articles goes into Crossmark data. A lot of this data that we need is historically, it's in publishers' historic data, right? So we all have it. Just needs to be out there so that people can get into it, because then we can find these duplicate submissions. And as I said, that's a hallmark of paper mill activity. It starts to become very obvious when you look at all the duplicate submissions where the paper mills are. It's a bit optimistic to say all the paper mills, just because not all the paper mills actually go through the peer review system. Big lot of them just go straight into special issues without any peer review. Okay. You can do this, by the way, this duplicate submissions check. You can do this with the open source Sage rejected article tracker. Okay, so it's a free open tool that you can use for this. One thing that isn't open is the tools that we use for the paper mill alarm. Actually, a number of different pipelines here now. When I say paper mill alarm, I'm really talking about the rating system that we have, which is saying that things get, say, like a red alert or a green alert, depending on whether they are suspicious or not. And this lets us do some modeling. You know, we can actually look at trends over a period of time. So this particular journal didn't have that many submissions back in 2012, but over time, submissions rose, and then these alerts started coming out. Okay, this is all retrospective. We actually couldn't see these at the time because we hadn't invented the paper mill alarm at that time. But at this point at the end of 2020, this journal appeared on the Chinese Academy of Sciences warning list. And following that, the number of submissions appears to have dropped precipitously, and to the point where this journal has effectively been abandoned. What's great about the paper mill alarm is that we can actually detect the stuff before peer review, which means that these sorts of trends don't have to happen in the future. If you want to learn a bit more, by the way, I've got my my blog down here, which is a few more details about this, but also feel free to reach out with any questions. So open methods are a bit of a double-edged sword. Okay, so we've got things like, well, I'll give you an example. We had this paper about duplication in peer review last year, and you can see it's kind of what I was describing before, where you have these authors, these are these green dots, and we're connecting them with dodgy behavior. Okay, and the problem here is that these are actually all fake referee accounts, and they're all duplicating content, which is how we know they're fake, because we couldn't have all these people just sharing fake referee reports. And really, you know, KYA, those kind of practices could have really helped here in preventing these kind of accounts getting into the system. The question was, should we share this? Should we actually tell people and publish this result, tell people that this is something that paper mills are doing, this kind of manipulation? And this is how to find it as well. Because if you share the method, on the one hand, it makes it more effective because other people can use it, but it might make it less effective because people can learn how to work around it. And so we considered these and we decided to publish. And actually what we found is that publishers did use it. They have historic data they can run this on. Paper mills can't do anything about that. And they found a lot of cases, just like what we found. Okay, so in summary, open science practices create the basis for better research integrity, particularly this many eyes effect, where the more people can see something, the more likely they are to detect the problems. Open metadata is critical. It's absolutely fundamental to being able to detect these kinds of issues. And there's a balance when it comes to methods, okay? Transparency is an important ethical principle. Some methods can be open, other methods shouldn't be shared widely because they're sensitive. Okay, thank you very much.
That's great. That's great. Thanks very much, Adam. There's a huge amount of information in there. Really interesting about sharing actually the methods for paper mills as well. And nice to see that, because many publishers are reluctant to share information or make the information public in case it just increases the armory of the fraudsters. But in your case, it actually was beneficial. And openness, even amongst that, will help in the arms race. So that's great. Please, a reminder to everyone, put your questions in the Q&A. And we're going to hand over now to Brian to give us a slightly broader picture around the issues. Thanks very much, Brian.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you everybody for coming to this really important session and topic, because this is really something that it affects everybody. I have the ironic task of noting that, yes, open science is important, but it's not actually sufficient to address some of these challenges. So what I would like to do is talk about the long game for open science, or for addressing paper mills and the problem, and acknowledge first that the issues that Dorothy and Adam and solutions that they raised are very useful. The making the papers openly available, imposing disclosure and reporting standards on those papers, having peer reviews public, having data shared, measures, protocols, sharing the code, pre-registration and registered reports. All of these things make it increasingly inconvenient for doing fraudulent work, publishing fraudulent work, and make it increasingly easy for detecting that work for all the reasons that both Adam and Dorothy described. The key is that it is more inconvenient for detecting, but that is primarily addressing the symptoms of the problem rather than the underlying cause, which is the reward system that motivates researchers to pursue these fraudulent practices in the first place. And that's really where I want to situate the comments today, to sort of give us some thoughts about how we deal with this in the near term and in the long term, if we're really going to fundamentally change the dynamics of the reward system to try to promote credible, high integrity research practice. So the base issue is that researchers need to publish. Katrina mentioned at the opening, researchers are increasingly desperate to publish. They have to publish. The demands on them are publication is needed to have a job, to advance in one's career, and everything else. So if a researcher is facing that demand, if they have resources available to do research, if they have the time available in their work to do that research, if they have the proper training to conduct research, if they're embedded in the scholarly community to generate ideas, to form collaborations, to formulate that research, and if they're in an institutional context that has the supports to make that research possible, then by and large, researchers are going to say, okay, great, I can conduct rigorous research and then I'll publish it, because the system that is structured, the environment that I'm in, facilitates this priority for doing research and sharing what I've learned. But that demand of publication has become increasingly popular, even in contexts where researchers do not have one or more of those things that they need to conduct rigorous research. The university demands that they publish, but they don't actually resource the researchers to do it. The institution wants publication, but the teaching load is so large that there is no bandwidth to do it. They demand publication even at different levels of experience in doing research. And so the researchers may not have the appropriate training. Researchers may be isolated in their particular context from a scholarly community in which they can develop ideas, test out possibilities in order to make a good, effective scholarly contribution. And the institution may demand productivity without providing the institutional supports to even make it possible. So in that context, they can't conduct rigorous research in the most extreme form. So then what do they do if they don't have those things? That's where the markets for predatory journals, paper mills, and other forms of misconduct have a value for researchers. I cannot meet it in the way that I would like to do the research. I have to meet this demand. And so these services provide a value to me so that I can publish and meet these draconian requirements that bear very little relation to what's possible for me. So in that context, we have to recognize that the reward system that is implemented by the various stakeholder groups, the institutions that researchers are part of, the publishers in which they publish their work, the societies that define the norms and standards for how work happens, the funders that fund work, all of them play critical roles in defining what does it mean for me as a researcher to succeed. And I have multiple motivations in pursuing that success. I'd like to have my job. I'd like to earn money in order to have a career and a productive life. I'm interested in earning reputation as a good researcher. And so to the extent that publication can help advance my reputation, I'm interested in that too. I genuinely want to make a contribution to scholarship. And that's an important motivation that I'm doing this. I'm in this field because I care about it. And I'm interested in feeling like I belong. And part of publication is an important part of contributing and participating in scholarship, being a member of the scholarly community. And so doing that activity is motivating for me. Now, the challenge is when resources are not sufficiently available, then confronts these motivations and forces me into decisions about what is it that I can do to still have a career or lose my career because I can't meet the demands for publication. So there are two options we could consider in that scenario. Is we could ask researchers to change their motivations. So don't be concerned with money. Don't be concerned with having your job. Just do the right thing. Operate with high integrity and see if you can produce research. If you can't because you don't have the resources or time or anything, well, you'll lose your job and you'll have to go do something else, but at least you'll have your integrity. That is not a realistic ask for standard human motivations. All of these motivations are reasonable things for researchers to have. And some of them are more fundamental to just being able to survive and thrive as a person in life, let alone in research. So the productive path isn't to try to ask researchers to change their motivations. Of course, we should promote research integrity. We should provide evidence about the value of that. But we have to recognize that a lot of these other factors will have influence, even if we can make the best possible case for operating with integrity because of the reality constraints that researchers find themselves in. So the more productive path, though also difficult, is to change how to earn the rewards. How is it that institutions and publishers and societies and funders can contribute to making a reward system that researchers can actually survive and thrive in? And particularly, how can they calibrate the requirements of the asks of researchers to the resources that researchers actually have available to them? For example, a university might say, we're trying to increase our standing in the research community, so we're going to ask researchers to produce more research. But if that doesn't come with resources to be able to produce more research, then it's creating that bind for researchers that then leads them potentially down that path toward misconduct. And why would universities put researchers in that situation? Well, we also have to recognize that those stakeholder agents also have motivations. Universities have concerns about funding their operation. They have concerns about their reputation as a contributing institution in the community. They genuinely, universities and every other stakeholder want to contribute to scholarly discourse. They have genuine motivations. And they also want to belong. An institution may say, we want to be part of the scholarly community. And being part of the scholarly community means our faculty produce research. And so we want to make sure that that happens. And those motivations are constrained by other agents that are shaping how it is those stakeholders make decisions. Could be a government policies, could be ranking systems about institutions, could be the general public's responsiveness to how it is institutions, publishers, societies operate. And so the university may be stuck between a government policy that says we want to increase our standing in science globally, so we want universities to produce more research output, but not simultaneously invest in research institutions for making that possible. So instead, the university says, well, I just have to hand down that expectation to the researchers, creating and maintaining these problems. So we will not escape this until we tackle many of these challenges, but they're very deep challenges because all of those agents have reasons with which they are trying to promote research, but inadvertently creating dysfunctional incentives for researchers to try to meet those demands. So the approach has to include the direct, immediate challenge of these many papers that are occurring and increasing detection of that to make misconduct like this more inconvenient and to increase the reliability of detecting and removing those from the literature, because that's an urgent and immediate problem. There are medium and long-term things that we can start to do, with the medium term focusing on how is it that we can initiate some change to that overall reward system that researchers and even stakeholders both create and are constrained by. And the focus there might be on changing what is needed to achieve publication. If we can, for example, separate publication from evaluation and make it trivially easy to publish, but then we move the bar from, well, anybody can publish anything at any time. So instead, the focus becomes the reward moves to the evaluation. So if anybody can publish anything at any time, it's not a signal of anything productive. Instead, for me to signal that I've actually done legitimate research is I need that evaluation, the peer review, the commentary to say that I have done good work. So separating those two provides an opportunity to do things like what Dorothy called out, which is as peer review becomes more transparent, then there's greater focus on that as the legitimizing agent of what it is to decide whether that's good scholarship or not. And in the long term, those types of interventions might shift and alter the stakeholders' incentive strategies themselves, how it is they incentivize researchers to do work and to right size the incentives from those stakeholders to what's actually possible for the researchers in which they are shaping the reward system, what's possible for them to do. And that's a fundamentally critical one. So I want to close with noting that a lot of our discussion is about how is it that we increase the standards for legitimate efforts, promote open practices so that the data, the materials, all of these other things are available as signals, as Adam described, and as things that make it much harder to do misconduct. All of that is good. But these markets aren't going to go away quickly, and they'll continue to try to navigate all of those changes that happen in increasing standards. So a complementary strategy would be to undermine the markets themselves and give researchers a solution that meets the reason they're going to a paper mill or to a predatory journal, gives them everything that they need from that, the publication and the signal of legitimacy of that publication, but give it to them for free, and therefore disrupt the actual market that exists there in the first place, with a place to put any type of content of any kind that is the reason that they would otherwise pay for it, so that that marketplace gets undermined simultaneously while the standards are being improved from the other end, to put increasing pressure on moving the entire community towards better and open practices. So I'll end with that because I'm sure there's lots of interesting ideas and discussion to unpack, both with the most direct detection strategies and the broader system and how it changes. So thanks very much for your attention and time.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was great, and I think speaks to the huge complexity of this system, but also echoes in some ways what Dorothy was talking about at the start, about not treating the symptoms of this virus that we essentially have, when we actually need to go and tackle the underlying causes which impact every single actor in different ways in the system. I have to say, personally, I like your medium crazy idea. And the one thing that wasn't mentioned is, and in some respects, separating publication from evaluation was what PLOS One tried to do with sort of objective sound science type of principles. And again, that's come up with it is successful at one thing, but the rise of preprints and making preprints available seems to be an obvious route to get to that medium term solution. So let's go to the questions. I've asked the speakers to also flag questions to me that are of particular interest, but I do want to pick up on one issue which hasn't been touched on, but which Allegra Swift has asked in relation to Adam Day, but I'd like the responses from all the speakers. So this, she says, on your detecting dodgy behavior slide, how do you avoid bias and exclusion if you are turning to those you know and know well? While we know that research has shown that this then privileges established white males, prestige institutions, global north, established journals that are doing the gatekeeping, and actually keeps out the huge amount of incredibly valuable research one way or another from low and middle income countries, from ethnic minorities, from global south researchers who don't have that. So Adam, perhaps I'll turn to you for that first one, and then and Dorothy respond to it.
I was aware when I was putting that slide together that I would have been nice to have had more diversity in the slide, but this was the image of older scientist, I think, that I got when I searched for a stock image. Maybe that's a sign of prejudice in itself. But as I said in the presentation, finding somebody with, say, an empty orchid or something is not cause for prejudice. It's cause for learning more and just making sure that you know who this individual is. Perhaps you go and look at their institution, look at other papers that have come from their group. You look at maybe have just a search around for them. You might find that even though they don't have an orchid, they actually do have papers that they've published in the past that show that they are doing good, legitimate work. They might have a different email address somewhere. That's worth checking, because sometimes you find that there's the fake email address the paper mill is using, and there's the real email address that the author actually has. So there's a lot of things to check there, but I would say it's not always going to be about being suspicious. It's just about essentially a matter of due diligence and just making sure that you know the individual a bit better before starting to work with them. And I think that's become more important recently. But I think it's quite a separate thing as well to the matter of being more prejudiced to established figures. But that's certainly an issue as well that needs to be addressed.
I noticed someone else just added to the questions. What about ECRs? Because again, they tend to be unknown. They are and those that are actually trying to be more open tend to get penalized as well and evicted from the system. Dorothy and Brian. Dorothy. Next.
Yeah, I mean, I would say openness is the answer, rather than just relying on the attributes of somebody that you can sort of pull off that have to do with where they come from and what sort of level of seniority they have. And of course, we know that some of the worst fraudsters in the world are incredibly famous, eminent white males who've done some pretty shocking things in their time, but they don't tend to run paper mills. They tend to sort of be more artisanal in their fraudulent activities. But no, I just think one should always keep that in mind. I mean, it's very worrying that paper mills are focused in particular countries. They're focused, originally, a lot of them are coming from China, a lot of them are coming from Iran. And if you say this, people might say, well, are you being prejudiced? Well, I think the problem is if you don't flag that up and you don't tackle it, the people I feel sorry for, the honest people in China and the honest people in Iran who tend to write to me saying, I'm working in a lab and my PI is insisting that I do all these dishonest things. What can I do? And they feel that they've got a double whammy because they're going to have people assuming that they're dishonest because they're from these particular countries where paper mills are known to operate, and they're under pressure to either join a paper mill or, leave the field. So it's a massive problem. And I think, it's just very important to always keep at the back of your mind that those people exist and they really need supporting more than anybody else, because they are, they've got the double pressure against them. And we need to encourage exactly those people who are going to, contradict and try and challenge the paper mills in their countries. But it's pretty scary seeing what's going on in some countries where and not just countries like it, all countries, you sometimes get senior people who are just promoting a culture of fraud and in their junior people. It's one reason why I'm quite passionate about tackling it, because I think it's very shocking how many junior people feel pressurized to do science badly.
Yeah, that speaks to the whole role model and the fact that we've selected a system for a system where we've got very hyper competitive leaders.
Yes.
In that, but that's another issue. Brian.
Yeah, I agree with the discussion. This is a deep challenge because reputations make a difference in what people's initial assumptions are, and so there is inevitable potential for greater heterogeneity in how people respond to someone that doesn't yet have an established reputation for their work versus who does. So for my perspective, the key part for addressing potential issues of bias is to establish these tools based on observable behaviors that build up to a reputation, rather than reputational stakes being based on social identity, where they live, how they grew up, what they look like, etc. Those are features of individuals for their lives, but they're not features of fraudulent misconduct activity. So it's focusing on the behaviors, I think, that is the critical element.
Yeah, which goes back exactly to the main thrust of your talk. And as Dorothy says, it's really important that anyone anywhere in the world has the opportunity to contribute to the scientific endeavour. So there are a bunch of other questions. One of the questions here from someone who's anonymous is that a lot of publishers and people who work in scholarly communications are very supportive of open research practice in principle, including open, transparent peer review, promoting registered reports, and so on, data sharing. Some of the barriers, however, to rolling these out as standard lie with not so much the concerns of the authors, but by journal editors and scholarly societies who don't want to have that extra workload, or fear that they will put off authors by implementing such policies, and so they won't get the submissions. So how do you suggest that publishers actually bring editors and authors around to them, so they are actually open to implementing these policies on their journals? So I'll just open that up to anyone who feels that, because we have focused a lot on the authors in this case.
I can just say I think it's going to be slow, and I don't have an easy answer, but I think I'm encouraged by the fact that there have been real innovation coming, for example, from the Wellcome Trust with their journal Wellcome Open Research as a sort of role model for how to do things differently. The Royal Society has got open research. So these highly sort of eminent and reputable organizations, certainly in the UK, are to some extent leading the way, trying to shift this model. And I think the more they do that and are seen to be succeeding, the more other organizations will follow. So I think it's a case of persuading those who might have most influence to recognize the severity of the problem and how these are solutions. But I agree with the diagnosis. I think that is absolutely true. And I've come across that myself when I've said to certain journals, will you adopt registered reports? And they're worried it will turn people off as authors and it will damage their impact factor. I just get cross when that happens, I'm afraid.
It is, and the reality of that happens a huge amount. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, this is a big challenge, and effective culture reform really requires recognizing that there are these diverse concerns by the agents of change, journal editors and otherwise. And so how is it that you meet them? They start with the idealists, the editors that don't care about those factors and do just want to publish the most robust, rigorous research possible, because they are the champions that then provide proof of concept that all of those worries don't actually occur, or identify when they do, because that's important to know too, and then become an evidence base of a shift in norms. This is starting to move. There are actors that are doing it. There's even high credibility, prestige actors that are doing it. And so then as that has become visible, it becomes harder and harder for the individuals that are more resistant to the initial ideas to maintain that resistance. The evidence shows that in fact it's effective. Others are doing it, showing that it's in fact implementable. And the potential downstream consequences that were the worries aren't actually coming to pass. And that's already true for data sharing, for adoption of registered reports, for peer registration. A lot of these standards, I put a link into Top Factor, have been adopted by hundreds or even thousands of journals. And the presumed negative consequences of the most recalcitrant aren't showing the types of, they aren't evident in the way that they're concerned. That's not to say that there are no problems with these implementations. There are plenty of things that can go wrong. But the benefits are so far clearly outweighing the perceived costs.
Yeah, Adam, do you want to chip in to that?
I feel like it's slightly outside of my area. I guess what I would say though is just that, so when I used to be a journal editor, one thing I tried to do was a version of open peer review for my journal, which was done purely through literally a blog, and the way I approached that was kind of like what I said, it's open is different. So having those posts there on the blog, these are different to the peer review reports, right? So the peer review reports are kind of behind closed doors, and they would say things like the really critical stuff, which is potentially harmful if it gets out into the real world, but it's useful in that context. But then out in the real world, well, there's useful things you can do there too. Like, for example, if you have an open peer review report saying, this paper is brilliant, here are all the best bits about it that you've got to go and read, that's really helpful for the author because it shows that somebody is recognizing their work and shows people where that they should focus their attention in the manuscript. So it's different. And I think once people can see that there's these different approaches that have value, they don't necessarily have to throw out the other approaches if those work in concert. But they have to accept that things are different. I think as Dorothy said, it's going to be slow.
Yeah, and the risk is that any individual journal doing this, it's difficult to get the evidence that it works unless it's done more collectively. And I think also that rather than relying on individual journals or editors, we actually need scholarly societies and academies and disciplines to create norms around open peer review, sharing data, in much the same way that gene sequences were adopted essentially across the discipline to open those up and to remove that fear and almost give permission to editors to say, you have to do this. Now, does anyone else spotted a question? I can keep plugging away here at this. We'll have a look. So I'd like you all to have a look because we've got 20 open questions still to go. One of the questions, which I think speaks to the sort of detection of the symptoms more than anything, is a comment, and it speaks to the arms race between fraudsters and others, is with the advent of and the increasing sophistication of ChatGPT, do you think we're going to see a greater rise, a further rise in fake articles and fake reviews that are actually probably undetectable? And how can we mitigate against this? So your views on ChatGPT and authorship.
Yeah. So I might just say a few things. I've done a couple of blog posts if people want to have a look at what I've been saying about ChatGPT. I think it's a very serious problem, because not just because it makes fake things that are hard to detect, but because it's going to do it at a much faster rate. So we're already seeing this going at a fast rate. It's just going to accelerate from here. But it's not necessarily undetectable. Actually, we had a Twitter conversation the other day about this, that there's a thing that ChatGPT will sometimes say when it gets a question it can't answer. It'll say, well, as an AI model, I can't answer this question because of reasons. But if you just search for as an AI model in some search engines, you will find papers that have that phrase in them because somebody has just dumped the output of ChatGPT into a paper. And some of those are legit. Some of those are actually people talking about their interactions with ChatGPT, which is fine, but not all of them are, and you can find them quite easily. Other cases we've seen where a reference list has been made by ChatGPT. ChatGPT cannot make reference lists, and it falls down pretty quickly. And you can tell, you see this, and you go, okay, there's no way a human wrote this. It's a mess.
Can I just comment on the business about, I mean, I agree. I think we're going to see a lot more and it's going to be very, very fast. But this is where the pre-registration constraint really could help, and the open data. Somebody on Twitter was asking, can ChatGPT generate plausible data? And there's interest. I mean, again, I think probably at the moment it can't. Maybe in future it will be able to do so. But it's what Brian's saying. You're making it harder and harder and harder for the fraudsters if you require the data, if you require the analysis code, and if you require a sensible time lag between a protocol or some sort of plan being pre-registered and the thing appearing. It would stop that in its tracks. So the funny thing is, some of us who've been arguing for things like pre-registration for the past 10 years hadn't really seen this as an advantage of it, but I think it might be the thing that forces it to become much more widely adopted, because it really just, if somebody's generating, tens and tens of papers on, or hundreds of papers in an area where it takes usually 2 years to do a study, then it's clearly something terribly wrong. You've got to have that lag.
Yeah, I think just to reinforce what's being said, I think the productive path is to assume that everything can become fakeable over time. It's changing so quickly. Why presume that we will always be able to detect it? We won't. So we have to continue to improve ways, as both Adam and Dorothy are describing, of creating more of the life cycle being open for the entire process, so that generating the content isn't sufficient. It's also you would have to fake the process, the actual work getting done. That gets much harder. And then ultimately, we have to solve, why would you want to fake it in the first place? And that's the whole point of addressing those motivations, right?
Yeah, and maybe we should come back to that. We haven't got much time left. Back to the causes of the problem in the first place and how to solve them. So there's a number of questions in the chat about impact factors and the reliance of institutions and funding agencies in using impact factors. And of course, the impact factors themselves create huge commercial gain for publishers and others, and which speaks to the incentive. So how can we get funders and institutions to move away from that sooner rather than later, and then what practical steps can we do in terms of putting a valuation on the practices that we want researchers to see, and how we can do that. Now, I don't know if you've spotted other questions that are relevant, but I would love a response to that, perhaps from Dorothy and from
I think you should start with Brian on that one.
Well, I was going to start with Brian, but Brian presented such a wonderful view that I just wanted to get your take on that, and then let Brian respond to both of you rather than me responding, if that would work.
Well, I mean, I just agree with Brian, basically. So, I mean, I've spoken about, things like the open practices preventing and helping prevent fraud. But of course, ultimately, it is the change to our institutions and our structures. And there's baby steps. I mean, you're trying to turn around a great big ship here, because it's, been charging along down this path. But there is concern, certainly in UK and in many countries in Europe, and I think also in the US, and elsewhere, I'm sure, that people are getting a bit concerned about, and it's somebody else in the chat was sort of saying, well, who's motivated to change any of this? The point is, at the end of the day, if we get the science wrong, we're screwed, basically. We're facing pandemic, we're facing environmental catastrophe. If people are putting out papers that make no sense in helping us address scientific issues that are important for the world, we're in deep trouble. And so I think there is, most sensible people, it doesn't really matter whether you're a capitalist or not a capitalist. You realize if we get, in fact, sometimes somebody was saying, well, the capitalists are not interested. Well, the capitalists actually often support research and development and science, partly because they want to make money out of it, but also because, in a sense, getting it right is good for humanity and society, and things then start to move forward. So I think once the problem is really recognized, people will start trying to address it. And I think that is already beginning to happen. But it is, you almost need to have a generation dying out so that you can turn the ship around and people stop just doing what has always come naturally to them.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Adam.
I think it's slightly out of my area. I think of Clear Skies as being all about kind of detection and not so much about policy, but certainly, the recurring theme is incentives. There need to be incentives to do science well, and it's very, very hard to come up with a metric that is really in line with that. So I think that is a serious problem, and it's probably never going to be perfect, but there's definitely scope for it to be better than it is now. I guess the other thing is, disincentivizing poor behavior, because at the moment, I think I've seen cases where an author has had a paper retracted for paper milling, and it's still in their CV. You can go and find their CV online, and they've still got it there. And I think that's because no one's checking. No one's actually going and looking at all of the articles on their CV and checking to see if any of these have been retracted. So it's, how can we make it more of a problem to have one of these, get caught with one of these papers, and therefore people think twice about doing it. And I think there's a lot of potential there as well.
Brian, would you like to respond?
Yeah, and this is the fundamental question, is how to shift the overall research culture. And the positive answer is that there are many people in the research culture that want it to change. And the last 10 years of reform is evidence of that. Very few researchers get into research because they say, I want to write a ton of papers and fill a CV. Right? That's just not a thing. Researchers get into research because they're motivated by discovery, they're curious, all of the things that create this interest in a career track. Likewise, there are many people that work at publishers, that work at funders, that work in societies, that work at institutions that really care about the mission of advancing knowledge. And they recognize that the system as it is doesn't work. So those are the agents of change that are doing positive, proactive steps as a bottom-up effort to get us all there. The other positive element is that there is now broad national and international efforts to start to change some of the structures from a public policy perspective. The UNESCO report, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the United States, several of these are really taking bigger steps on some parts of the problem to shift those incentives and reward systems. There's a long way to go, but there's a lot of reason to feel positive. On the negative side is that there are some agents in the system whose survival depends on the current system, and they are not going to change easily. So I'll call out the ranking systems, for example, ranking of universities, US News and World Report for US systems and some of the global ones. These are corrosive and they play such a huge role in how institutions make decisions about how they operate. And if they include metrics that create dysfunction in how research happens, the institutions will conform to them and the whole system suffers as a consequence. And those ranking systems in the present model have very little incentive to change because they get what they want, right? They get students every day saying, where do I go to school? And, oh, I want to see that it's high on the ranking. And so this is very problematic. So for the agents that actively benefit from the existing system, we have to also complement this bottom-up positive proactive work with interventions that undermine those markets. And that's where the proposal the crazy one at the end that I suggest, this Journal of Unscholarship. If we provide a solution that is free and just for all this crazy research, and we provide all of the elements. So this is a collaboration among legitimate publishers to say, yeah, we'll give it an impact factor. Yeah, we'll compartmentalize these citations and let people get thousands and thousands of citations from this crazy journal. But we have quarantined it because we know where they're publishing it. We know how to tag the metadata for it. And we can distinguish that kind of behavior, which is just responsive to all of these bad incentive and reward systems, so that we can undermine that market, point out how crazy it is to operate based on impact factor and otherwise, and move everybody else toward a more productive system.
Yeah. And that needs coordinated action by institutions. I think actually open access would never have happened without that disruption to the market actually being forced by some funders.
Exactly.
Welcome and others. We have unfortunately come to time. Thank you so much. This is such a huge topic. I'm sure we could have a sequel about this. Thank you all for your contributions today and for taking time to share your expertise. And I'm really sorry to everyone here that we haven't got through all the questions, and I was struggling a bit to try and juggle between them. We will try and make sure that we provide you with responses to all of them. And thank you so much to all the participants for coming as well. So with that, we'll say goodbye to everyone and thank you again.